The morning sun painted the Wyoming Valley in shades of gold and amber as Jedediah Stone guided his buckskin horse, Buck, through the winding cattle trail. Their partnership was a thing of beauty to behold, man and horse, moving as one entity, communicating through the slightest pressure of knee against flank, the gentlest touch of rein against neck. "Easy now, Buck," Jed murmured, his weathered hands steady on the reins as they approached a skittish calf that had wandered from the herd. The horse seemed to understand not just the words, but the very intention behind them. Buck positioned himself perfectly, allowing Jed to guide the wayward animal back to safety without so much as raising his voice. At 32, Jed had spent the better part of his life working the land, and in all those years he'd never encountered a horse quite like Buck. The buckskin stallion possessed an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. Where other horses might spook at shadows or sudden noises, Buck would pause, assess, and react with calculated precision. When Jed was injured the previous winter thrown from a different horse while breaking ice from the water, Trough's Buck had stood guard over him for hours in the bitter cold, refusing to leave even when the other horses had wandered back to the barn seeking warmth. "You're more human than most humans I know," Jed often told the horse, and he meant it. Buck's dark eyes held a depth of understanding that sometimes unsettled visitors to the small ranch. The horse would study newcomers with an intensity that seemed to peer straight into their souls, and Jed had learned to trust Buck's judgment of character. When the horse laid his ears back and shifted nervously, Jed knew to be cautious. When Buck nickered softly and approached with his head lowered, the person was worth knowing. The Stone Ranch wasn't much by most standards, a modest cabin, a sturdy barn, and enough grazing land to support a small herd of cattle. But it was honest work, and Jed took pride in every fence post he'd driven, every beam he'd raised. He'd inherited the property from his father, along with a small debt to the Cattleman's Bank in Cedar Ridge. It was a manageable debt, one he'd been steadily paying down through careful management and hard work. As they crested the hill overlooking the town of Cedar Ridge, Jed felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Today was the day he'd have to visit Silas Croft at the bank to discuss the final payment on his father's loan. Jed had the money, every dollar, earned through sweat and sacrifice, but something about Croft always made him uneasy. Buck seemed to share his apprehension, his ears swiveling forward toward the town with an alertness that suggested he, too, sensed something amiss. "I know, boy," Jed said, patting the horse's neck. "I don't much like going to town either, but a man pays his debts." They rode into Cedar Ridge just as the church bell was striking 10. The town was bustling with its usual weekday activity: women hanging laundry, children playing in the dusty streets, men loading supplies onto wagons. Several people waved to Jed as he passed, and he touched the brim of his hat in response. He was well regarded in Cedar Ridge, known for his honesty and his skill with horses. When folks had trouble with a difficult animal, they came to Jed Stone at the livery stable. Young Timmy Fletcher looked up from mucking stalls, his face breaking into a wide grin. At 14, Timmy was all elbows and knees, with unruly brown hair and freckles scattered across his nose like stars. He'd been working at the stable for 2 years, ever since his father died in a mining accident, helping his mother make ends meet. "Morning, Mr. Stone." "Morning, Buck," Timmy called out, wiping his hands on his overalls. Buck whickered softly in response, lowering his head so the boy could scratch behind his ears. The horse had always been gentle with Timmy, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "Morning, Timmy," Jed replied, dismounting. "Mind looking after Buck while I tend to some business?" "At the bank?" "Course not," Timmy said eagerly. "Buck and me, we understand each other, don't we, boy?" As if in response, Buck nuzzled the boy's shoulder, making Timmy laugh. Jed smiled at the sight. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, The pure joy of a boy, and his favorite horse was a reminder that goodness still existed. "I'll be back within the hour," Jed said, shouldering his saddlebags. Inside was the money for Croft, more than enough to settle his account and finally be free of the bank's hold on his ranch. The Cattlemen's Bank of Cedar Ridge occupied the corner of Main and 3rd Streets, an imposing brick building that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Silas Croft had spared no expense in its construction, importing materials from back east and hiring the finest craftsmen. It was a temple to commerce, and Croft was its high priest. Jed pushed through the heavy oak doors, his boots echoing on the polished marble floor. The interior was all dark wood and brass fixtures, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Behind the ornate teller cages, clerks worked quietly, their ledgers and counting machines creating a soft symphony of commerce. "Mr. Stone," came a smooth voice from across the lobby. "Right on time, as always." Silas Croft emerged from his private office, resplendent in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most folks in Cedar Ridge made in 6 months. At 55, he was a distinguished man with silver hair and calculating gray eyes. He extended a manicured hand, and Jed shook it briefly, noting how soft the banker's palm felt compared to his own calloused grip. "Mr. Croft," Jed replied, following the banker into his opulent office. The walls were lined with expensive books and framed certificates, while a massive desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it hung a portrait of Croft himself, painted in oils and mounted in an elaborate gilt frame. "Please sit," Croft said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "I trust you've come to discuss your father's account?" "I have," Jed said, placing his saddlebags on the floor beside his chair. "I've got the money to pay it off in full, with interest." For just a moment, something flickered in Croft's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, or annoyance, but it was gone so quickly that Jed might have imagined it. "Excellent," Croft said, though his smile seemed forced. "Your father would be proud. He was a good man. Your father, honest to a fault." As Jed counted out the bills and coins, he couldn't shake the feeling that Croft was studying him with unusual intensity. The banker's fingers drummed silently on the desk, and his eyes kept flicking to the money with an expression that Jed couldn't quite read. "That should do it," Jed said, pushing the last of the payment across the desk. "Principal, interest, and a little extra for good measure." Croft scooped up the money with practiced efficiency, his hands moving quickly as he counted and sorted. "Indeed, this should settle the account completely," he said. "I'll have the papers drawn up and sent to your ranch within the week." "Much obliged," Jed said, rising from his chair. "It'll be good to have that weight off my shoulders." "I'm sure it will," Croft replied, but there was something in his tone that made Jed pause. The banker was studying him again, as if memorizing his face, his clothes, his every detail. "Is there something else, Mr. Croft?" "Not at all," Croft said quickly. Well, I hope you won't be a stranger, Mr. Stone. The bank always has opportunities for men of your integrity." Jed nodded politely, though something about the way Croft emphasized the word integrity made his skin crawl. He retrieved his saddlebags and headed for the door, eager to be away from the banker's penetrating stare. "Mr. Stone," Croft called, out just as Jed reached the door. "That's a fine horse you ride. A real beauty. I've always admired intelligent animals." "Buck's special, all right," Jed replied. "Been with me for 5 years now. Couldn't ask for a better partner." "Partner," Croft repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I can see how you think of him that way. Such loyalty is rare." There was something unsettling about the way Croft spoke of Buck, as if the horse were already his. Jed felt a chill run down his spine, but he pushed the feeling aside. His business was done, his debt was paid, and he was free to go home to his ranch and his life. Outside the bank, Jed took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The oppressive atmosphere of Croft's office had left him feeling claustrophobic, and he was eager to collect Buck and head home. As he walked toward the livery stable, he failed to notice the figure watching him from the bank's second-story window, or the calculating expression on Silas Croft's face as the banker planned. His next move dotted the stable, Buck nickered softly at Yet's approach, as if sensing his master's unease. Timmy was brushing the horse's coat, chatting away about his morning chores and the other horses in his care. "He's been real patient," Timmy reported. "Just stood here quiet-like, but his ears kept twitching toward the bank. Almost like he was listening for you." "That's Buck for you," Jed said, patting the horse's neck. "Always knows where I am." He handed Timmy a silver dollar. "Thanks for looking after him." "Anytime, Mr. Stone," Timmy said, pocketing the coin. "You heading home now?" "That's the plan," Jed replied, swinging up into the saddle. Buck stepped lively beneath him, eager to be away from town and back on familiar ground as they rode out. Of Cedar Ridge, Jed felt his spirits lifting. The debt was paid, the ranch was truly his, and the future looked bright. Behind them, the town grew smaller in the distance, and ahead lay the open range and home. Neither man nor horse suspected that they were riding toward a trap that had been years in the making, or that their simple transaction at the bank had sealed their fate. 3 days later, the tranquil morning peace of the Wyoming Valley was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats and the crack of gunfire. The westbound stagecoach from Cheyenne, carrying the quarterly payroll for the silver mines north of Cedar Ridge, rounded a bend in the canyon road to find its path blocked by a fallen tree. As the driver hauled back on the reins, bringing his 6-horse team to a sliding stop, 2 masked riders emerged from the rocks above. "Nobody move," shouted the leader, his face hidden behind a crude burlap mask. A fine wool coat covered his frame, expensive and out of place in the rugged landscape. "This is a robbery." The driver, Tom Hensley, was a veteran of a dozen such encounters. His weathered hands remained steady on the reins, even as his shotgun guard, young Pete Morrison, reached nervously for his weapon. "Don't even think about it." "Boy," the second robber called out, his own gun trained on Pete. "We ain't looking to hurt nobody, but we will if you force our hand." The leader's voice was cultured, refined, not the rough growl one might expect from a common highwayman. He spoke with the confidence of education and breeding, though his words carried the unmistakable threat of violence. "Throw down the strongbox," the leader commanded. "Nice and easy." Tom Hensley glanced at his guard, then at the passengers. Traveling salesman and an elderly woman visiting her daughter. His job was to protect the cargo, but he'd seen too many good men die over money that wasn't theirs to begin with. "Pete," he said quietly, "toss it down." The young guard hefted the heavy iron strongbox, his face flushed with shame and anger. The box hit the ground with a solid thud, raising a small cloud of dust. The second robber dismounted and quickly examined the box, producing a small set of tools from his saddlebags. Within minutes, he had the lock picked and the lid open, revealing neat stacks of bills and pouches of silver coins. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice carrying satisfaction. "Looks like Christmas came early this year." As the robbers loaded their bounty into canvas sacks, the leader's horse, a dark bay with distinctive white markings, pranced nervously. The animal's agitation seemed to unsettle its rider, and for a moment the man's attention was divided between controlling his mount and overseeing the theft. It was then that Buck, carrying Jed along the ridge trail above the canyon, caught wind of the commotion below. A buckskin stallion's ears pricked forward, and he came to an immediate halt, his entire body tensing with alertness. "What is it, boy?" Jed whispered, dismounting and moving to calm his horse. "Through the scrub oak and Pine, he could see the stagecoach stopped in the road below. The two armed men dividing their stolen treasure. Yet's first instinct was to help, but he was one man against two, and they were well positioned with good cover. Instead, he remained hidden, memorizing every detail he could, the leader's expensive coat, the nervous bay horse, the methodical way the second robber worked. Most importantly, he watched as the leader removed his mask for a moment to wipe sweat from his brow, revealing a face that seemed vaguely familiar, though Jed couldn't place it from his distant vantage point. Buck stood perfectly still beside him, as if understanding the need for silence. The horse's dark eyes were fixed on the scene below, and something in his posture suggested he was not just watching, but remembering. The robbery was over within 10 minutes. The masked men secured their saddlebags, mounted their horses, and rode east toward the Badlands, leaving behind a shaken driver, a humiliated guard, and passengers who would have stories to tell for years to come. Jed waited until the dust had settled before mounting Buck and riding quickly down to the road. "Everyone all right?" he called out as he approached the stagecoach. "Jed Stone," Tom Hensley exclaimed with relief. "Glad to see a friendly face. We just been robbed." "I saw," Jed replied grimly. "Got a good look at them from up on the ridge." Two men, well-armed and organized. One was wearing a fancy coat wool, expensive looking. They knew what they were doing. "That's more than we got," Pete Morrison said miserably. "Happened so fast, I barely saw their faces." "The leader had a nervous horse," Jed continued. "Dark bay with white markings on the front legs. Might be worth remembering when the sheriff starts asking questions." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Sheriff Miller appeared around the bend, leading a posse of 6 men. The lawman was pushing 60, his hair gone gray, and his face lined with the wear of 3 decades keeping peace in a hard land. But his eyes were still sharp, and his hand steady on his gun. "Tom," the sheriff called out, "we heard shots. Everyone safe?" "Safe but poorer," Tom replied. 2 men with masks took the mining payroll. Jed here saw the whole thing from up on the ridge. Sheriff Miller turned his attention to Jed, his expression grim. "What can you tell me?" Jed recounted everything he'd observed, from the fallen tree barrier to the robbers' eastward escape. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. This was well planned, Miller concluded. They knew about the payroll, knew the route, knew exactly where to set their ambush. This wasn't the work of drifters or desperate men. This was professional. "What's the next step?" Jed asked. "We follow their trail while it's still fresh," the sheriff replied. "You willing to help, Jed? You've got the best tracking skills in the county." Jed looked at Buck, who was still staring in the direction the robbers had taken. The horse's behavior was unusual, more intense than his normal alertness. It was as if Buck had sensed something significant about the criminals, something that went beyond a simple robbery. "I'll help," Jed said. Buck's got a good nose for tracking. For the next 6 hours, Jed led the posse through the Badlands, following a trail that grew fainter with each mile. The robbers had been clever, sticking to rocky ground where possible, using stream beds to mask their horses' prints. By evening, the trail had gone completely cold. "Damn," Sheriff Miller muttered as they made camp near Willow Creek. "It's like they just vanished into thin air." "They'll surface eventually," Jed said, unsaddling Buck near the creek. "Men like that don't steal money just to bury it. They'll want to spend it, and when they do, someone will notice." Buck drank deeply from the creek, but his attention kept drifting back toward Cedar Ridge. The horse's behavior was becoming more unusual by the hour, a restlessness that Jed had never seen before. When they'd made camp, Buck had tried to wander back toward town twice, forcing Jed to hobble in to keep him from straying. Something's got you spooked, hasn't it, boy? Jed murmured, stroking the horse's neck. I wish you could tell me what you saw out there. If only he had known that Buck was indeed trying to tell him something, something that would soon become a matter of life and death. The posse returned to Cedar Ridge the following morning empty-handed and frustrated. News of the robbery had spread quickly through the town, and clusters of citizens gathered on street corners to discuss the crime and speculate about the robbers' identities. At the bank, Silas Croft held court in his office, entertaining a steady stream of visitors, who came to express their outrage and concern. The stolen payroll had been insured by his bank, and the loss represented a significant blow to the institution's reputation. Terrible business, Croft said for the 10th time that morning, shaking his head sadly. In my father's day, such lawlessness would never have been tolerated. The town has grown soft, I'm afraid. Too trusting, too willing to give strangers the benefit of the doubt. His visitor, the town's mayor, nodded gravely. What do you think, Silas? Could this be the work of outsiders, or someone local? Croft leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture of thoughtful consideration. I hate to say it, but I fear this crime bears the hallmarks of inside knowledge. The robbers knew exactly when the payroll would be traveling, exactly which route it would take. That suggests someone with access to confidential information. Someone local, then? I'm afraid so, Croft replied with apparent reluctance. Of course, I don't like to cast aspersions on anyone without proof. But the sheriff should certainly look closely at anyone who might have had financial difficulties, anyone who might have been desperate enough to resort to such measures. The mayor left shortly thereafter, but Croft's words had already begun to take root. By noon, the seeds of suspicion had been planted, and by evening, they would bloom into full-blown accusations. It was Sheriff Miller who brought the devastating news to Yett's ranch. The lawman arrived just as the sun was setting, his face grave, and his manner formal. Buck, grazing in the corral, raised his head at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His ears pricked forward with unusual intensity. Evening, Sheriff, Jed called out from the porch, where he'd been mending a bridle. Any word on those robbers? That's what I'm here about, Miller replied, dismounting heavily. Jed, I need to ask you some questions, official questions. Something in the sheriff's tone made Yett's blood run cold. What kind of questions? The kind that might be better discussed inside, Miller said, away from prying eyes. In the cabin's small kitchen, over coffee that grew cold as they talked, Sheriff Miller laid out a case that seemed to build itself around Jed like a noose. There was the matter of his recent visit to the bank, where he'd paid off his father's loan with a suspiciously large sum of cash. There was his presence at the robbery scene, conveniently positioned to observe everything that happened. There was his intimate knowledge of the area and the stage routes. Now, I'm not saying I believe any of this, Miller said carefully. But questions are being raised, Jed. Important people in town are wondering where a struggling rancher got enough money to pay off a significant loan all at once. I saved it, Jed replied, his voice tight with growing anger. Every dollar, earned through honest work. You know me, Sheriff. You know I'm not a thief. I know what I want to believe, Miller said sadly. But I also know that desperate men sometimes do desperate things. And I know that your horse was acting mighty strange yesterday, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Before Jed could respond, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miller opened it to find 2 of his deputies, their faces grim with official business. Sheriff, the first deputy said, we found something you need to see. Outside, near the barn, the deputies had uncovered a burlap sack hidden beneath a pile of hay. Inside were a crude mask made from rough cloth, a handful of silver coins bearing the distinctive marks of the mining company, and most damning of all, a brass button, torn from an expensive wool coat. This was buried pretty shallow, the deputy reported, almost like someone wanted it to be found. Jed stared at the evidence in disbelief. Sheriff, you know this is impossible. I've been here all day, working on repairs. Mrs. Patterson from the next ranch over can vouch for me. She brought me some eggs this morning and stayed for coffee. But even as he spoke, Jed could see the doubt growing in Miller's eyes. The evidence was too convenient, too perfectly incriminating to be ignored. I'm sorry, Jed, the sheriff said heavily, but I'm going to have to place you under arrest. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. This is madness, Sheriff. Someone's setting me up. Maybe so, Miller replied, producing a pair of handcuffs. But until we sort this out, you're going to have to come with me. As the cold steel clicked around his wrists, Jed felt his world collapsing. In the corral, Buck had begun to pace frantically, his agitation growing more pronounced with each passing moment. The horse seemed to sense his master's distress, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. What about Buck? Jed asked desperately. He can't fend for himself. The bank will take care of that, Sheriff Miller said. Croft's already filed the paperwork to seize your assets as collateral for the stolen money. Your horse will be stabled in town until this matter is resolved. You can't do this. Jed protested. Buck doesn't understand. He'll think I've abandoned him. But the words fell on deaf ears. Within an hour, Jed found himself locked in the Cedar Ridge jail, watching helplessly through the barred window as strangers loaded his beloved horse into a trailer. Buck fought them every step of the way, his eyes wild with confusion and fear. The last thing Jed saw before the trailer disappeared around the corner was Buck's desperate gaze, searching for the master who couldn't come to his rescue. In his luxurious office above the bank, Silas Croft watched the proceedings with satisfaction. The plan had worked perfectly. The troublesome cowboy was behind bars. The stolen money was safely hidden where no one would ever think to look. And the intelligent horse that had witnessed too. Much was now under his control, but Croft had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had underestimated the loyalty of animals and the determination of those who love them. Buck was no ordinary horse, and his memory of that day in the canyon was about to become the key to exposing the truth. The game was far from over. The Cedar Ridge jail was a modest affair of 4 cells in the back of the sheriff's office, with thick iron bars and small, high windows that allowed only thin shafts of sunlight to penetrate the gloom. Jed sat on the narrow cot in the corner, cell, his head in his hands, still trying to comprehend how his life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. The evidence against him was overwhelming and perfectly orchestrated. Too perfectly, in fact. Someone had planned this frame with meticulous care. But who? And why? Jed racked his brain, trying to think of anyone who might harbor such hatred toward him, but came up empty. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, paid his debts, and treated others with respect. What could he have done to deserve such elaborate revenge? Through the small window, he could hear the sounds of Cedar Ridge going about its daily business wagon wheels, on cobblestones, children playing, dogs barking. Life continued while his own had ground to a halt. Somewhere out there, Buck was trapped in a stable, probably confused and frightened, wondering why his master had abandoned him. Jed? A familiar voice called softly from the front of the jail. Timmy? Jed rose from his cot and moved to the bars. The young stable boy stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands, looking nervous and uncertain. Sheriff Miller said I could visit for a few minutes, Timmy said, approaching the cell. I brought you some food from Ma She made extra stew. Jed accepted the warm bowl gratefully. Thanks, son. How's Buck doing? Timmy's face darkened. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Mr. Stone. Buck ain't doing well at all. He's been acting real strange ever since they brought him to the livery. Strange how? Well, First off, he won't eat. Won't touch his oats or hay. Just stands there staring toward the front of the stable. And he's been trying to get out of his stall something fierce. Kicked through 2 boards already, and Mr. Henderson is getting mighty upset about the damage. Jed felt his heart clench. Buck's distress was his fault, the result of circumstances beyond either of their control. He's probably just confused, he said, though he suspected there was more to it than that. That's not all, Mr. Stone, Timmy continued, lowering his voice. Every time Mr. Croft walks by the stable, which he's been doing a lot lately, Buck goes absolutely wild, rearing up, pawing at the ground, making these sounds I ain't never heard from a horse before. It's like he hates that man with every fiber of his being. This news sent a chill down Yet's spine. Buck's reaction to Croft was telling the horse had always been an excellent judge of character, and his obvious distress around the banker suggested something deeper than mere coincidence. There's something else, Timmy said, glancing around, to make sure they weren't overheard. Yesterday, when I was cleaning Buck's stall, I accidentally left the latch loose. Before I knew it, he'd pushed right out and was heading for the street. But here's the weird part, he wasn't running wild or nothing. He was walking real purposeful like, straight toward the edge of town, toward the old mill road. The mill road? Jed frowned. The abandoned flour mill sat about 2 miles east of Cedar Ridge, in a hollow by Willow Creek. It had been shuttered for years, ever since the railroad changed its route and made the mill economically unviable. Yes, sir. I had to rope him and lead him back, but he fought me every step of the way. Kept looking back toward that road, like there was something out there he needed to see. A spark of hope flickered in Yet's chest. Buck's behavior wasn't random, it was purposeful. The horse was trying to communicate something. But what? Timmy, Jed said urgently, I need you to do something for me. It might be dangerous, and I won't think less of you if you say no. The boy straightened up, his young face serious. Whatever you need, Mr. Stone. I know you didn't rob that stagecoach. You're the most honest man in this whole town. I need you to watch Buck. Really watch him. Pay attention to everything he does, every place he tries to go. And if he acts up around Croft again, I want you to remember exactly what happens. You think Buck knows something about the robbery? I think Buck saw something during the robbery, Jed corrected. Something that might prove my innocence. But I need your eyes and ears on the outside to figure out what it is. Timmy nodded solemnly. You can count on me, Mr. Stone. Buck and me, we'll get to the bottom of this. Over the next 3 days, Timmy became Yet's lifeline to the outside world. The boy visited twice daily, bringing food and news, but more importantly, reporting on Buck's increasingly erratic behavior. The horse's obsession with the mill road was becoming more pronounced. Every time he was let out of his stall for exercise, he would immediately try to head in that direction. When blocked, he would become agitated, pawing at the ground and whinnying in frustration. It was as if he was trying to lead someone somewhere. Specific, but couldn't make them understand. It's the damnedest thing I ever saw, Timmy reported on his 4th visit. Today, Mr. Henderson got so frustrated with Buck's carrying on that he had me take him out to the paddock behind the stable. But instead of grazing like a normal horse, Buck spent the whole time at the far fence, staring east toward the mill. Road and making these low, rumbly sounds. What kind of sounds? Like he was talking to himself, or maybe like he was remembering something that made him real upset. Jed felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to take shape in his mind. Buck had been with him on the ridge during the robbery. The horse had seen everything, the masked men, their actions, their escape route. But more than that, Buck might have seen something that Jed himself had missed. Timmy, I need you to try something, Jed said carefully. Tomorrow, when you're tending Buck, I want you to accidentally leave his stall unlatched again. But this time, instead of stopping him, follow him. See where he goes. What if he heads for the mill road? Then follow him there. But be careful, son. If I'm right about what Buck saw, then there might be someone who doesn't want that information to come to light. Timmy's eyes widened with understanding. You think whoever really robbed that stagecoach is still in town? I think whoever framed me is someone with power and influence, Jed replied grimly. Someone who could plant evidence on my property and make it stick. Someone who knew exactly how to make me look guilty. The next morning brought news that made Yet's blood run cold. Sheriff Miller arrived at the jail with a telegram from the territorial judge, setting Yet's trial for the following Monday, just 4 days away. I'm sorry, Jed, Miller said, genuinely regretful. I pushed for more time to investigate, but with all the evidence piled up against you, the judge wants this resolved quickly. The mining company is putting pressure on everyone. From here to Cheyenne, 4 days, Jed repeated numbly. That's not enough time to what? Miller asked. Jed, if you know something that might help your case, now's the time to speak up. But how could Jed explain that his best hope for vindication lay in the strange behavior of his horse? Who would believe such a story? He needed proof, solid evidence. That would stand up in court. And time was running out. That afternoon, Timmy arrived at the jail with barely contained excitement. I did it, Mr. Stone, the boy whispered urgently. I followed Buck. Where did he go? Straight to the old mill, just like you thought. But that ain't the strangest part. Timmy glanced around nervously before continuing. When we got there, Buck walked right up to the front door and started pawing at it, like he wanted to get inside. Then he walked around to the back of the building and did the same thing to a loose board in the wall. Yet's pulse quickened. Did you look inside? I tried, but it was too dark to see much. The place has been boarded up for years, but some of the boards are loose. Buck kept pushing at one particular spot with his nose, like he was trying to show me something specific. We need to get in there, Jed said urgently. Tonight, after dark. Can you manage it? Timmy nodded, though his face was pale with fear. I'll try, Mr. Stone. But what if someone catches me? Be careful, Jed warned. If I'm right, you might be walking into danger. But Timmy, this might be our only chance to find the truth before Monday's trial. As night fell over Cedar Ridge, Timmy made his way quietly through the darkened streets toward the livery stable. The moon was new, providing perfect cover for his clandestine mission. At the stable, Buck was waiting as if he somehow knew this moment would come. The horse's eyes gleamed in the darkness, alert and purposeful. All right, boy, Timmy whispered, carefully unlatching the stall door. Show me what you've been trying to tell us. Buck stepped out immediately, not with the wild energy he'd shown before, but with calm determination. He walked steadily through the sleeping town, his hooves muffled on the dirt streets, with Timmy following close behind, leading a small pony for the return journey. The old mill loomed against the starlit sky like a ghost from home. Cedar Ridge's moor. Prosperous past. Buck approached the building without hesitation, going directly to the loose board he'd shown Timmy earlier. The horse pawed at the wood, then looked back at the boy expectantly. Timmy pried at the board with his knife until it came free with a soft creak. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Taking a deep breath, the boy lit his small lantern and crawled inside. The mill's interior was thick, with dust and cobwebs, filled with abandoned machinery and grain sacks. But Buck's behavior outside had been too specific to ignore. The horse had been pointing to something particular. Timmy moved carefully through the debris, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the wall's dot in the far corner. Near what had once been the mill's office, several floorboards seemed newer than the others. Following Buck's earlier behavior, Timmy knelt and began examining them closely. One board was loose, and when he pried it up, his lantern revealed a cavity beneath dot inside were canvas bags heavy with silver coins, still bearing the mining company's distinctive stamps. But more importantly, stuffed beneath the money was a fine wool coat, expensive, tailored, and bearing a distinctive brass button pattern. One button was missing, torn away as if in haste. Timmy's hands shook as he examined the coat. It was exactly as Jed had described from his vantage point during the robbery, and the missing button matched perfectly with the one that had been planted at Yet's ranch. But the most damning evidence was what Timmy found in the coat's inner pocket, a monogrammed silk handkerchief bearing the initials SC. In elegant script, Silas Croft. Racing back to town with his precious evidence. Timmy burst into the sheriff's office just as the clock struck midnight. Sheriff Miller, dozing at his desk, startled awake at the commotion. "Timmy? What in blazes? Sheriff, you got to see this." Timmy gasped, dumping the stolen money and coat onto Miller's desk. "Buck led me right to it. The real robber's coat, and it ain't Yet's." Miller examined the evidence with growing amazement. The monogrammed handkerchief was particularly damning, but he needed one final piece of proof. "Timmy," he said slowly, "you said Buck was agitated around Croft. Well, there's something about that coat that might explain why." Using his magnifying glass, the sheriff examined the coat's collar carefully. There, caught in the wool fibers, was a single hair, buckskin colored and distinctive. "Horsehair," Miller said grimly. "Buck must have been close enough during the robbery to leave his mark on the robber's coat. That's why he's been so agitated." He recognized Croft's scent. Within an hour, Sheriff Miller and his deputies had surrounded Silas Croft's house. They found the banker in his study, frantically packing documents and cash into a leather satchel. "Going somewhere, Silas?" Miller asked, his gun drawn. Croft's cultured facade cracked immediately. "You don't understand, Miller. I built this town. I brought prosperity to Cedar Ridge. I deserved that money more than those miners who drink it away in saloons." "What you deserved was a fair trial," Miller replied. "But you won't get the chance to give one to Jed Stone." Croft made a desperate grab for a pistol on his desk, but Miller was faster. The banker's scheme ended with a whimper rather than the grandiose exit he'd probably envisioned. The next morning, Jed walked out of the Cedar Ridge jail a free man. The charges had been dropped, his property restored, and his reputation cleared. But none of that mattered as much as what waited for him at the livery stable. Buck stood in his stall, ears pricked forward, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. When he saw Jed approaching, the horse let out a soft whicker of pure joy. "Hello, boy," Jed said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I hear you've been busy." Buck nuzzled his master's shoulder, and for a long moment, man and horse simply stood together, their bond proven stronger than the lies and schemes of corrupt men. Timmy appeared beside them, grinning widely. "He never gave up on you, Mr. Stone. Not for a minute." "Neither did you, son," Jed replied, placing a grateful hand on the boy's shoulder. "I owe you both more than I can ever repay." "Well," Timmy said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking. With all the excitement, I might have developed a real interest in ranch work. You reckon you could use an apprentice?" Jed looked at the boy who'd risked everything to save him, then at Buck, who'd never stopped trying to reveal the truth. In a world where corruption could flourish and innocent men could be framed, it was good to know that loyalty still existed. "I reckon I could," he said, with a smile. "Buck and I could use a partner we can trust." As they walked out of Cedar Ridge together, man, boy, and horse, the morning sun painted the Wyoming Valley in shades of gold and promise. Justice had prevailed, not through the machinations of powerful men, but through the unwavering loyalty of those who understood that truth, like the bond between a cowboy and his horse, could never truly be broken. In the distance, Silas Croft's empire was already crumbling, his bank under investigation, and his crimes front-page news across the Nuga territory. But Jed Stone was heading home to his ranch, where honest work waited, and the future stretched out bright and clean as a mountain stream. Buck tossed his head and quickened his pace, eager to reach familiar pastures. He had done his job, protected his master, and proven that sometimes the most important witness to injustice walks on four legs and speaks without words. In the end, that had been enough.